and welcome to Book It. I'm Carol Anne Riddell. Joining us in the studio today, Gayle Forman, an award-winning author and journalist known for her popular and best-selling young adult books. Thanks so much for being here, Gayle.
I'm so glad to be here, Carol Anne.
So, you know, I'm always a little bit fascinated by authors who write for young readers, especially kind of that middle grade or teenage world, because I got to imagine it's not easy to do as an adult. Is there something in particular that attracts you to that age group?
I think for those of us who do it, it is easier to do.
Interesting.
I've written adult novels, and I've written young adult novels and middle grade novels, and I think I'm much better at the children's books than I am at the adult novels. And I just think it's the characters that come naturally to you, that you can channel the story you want to tell. I often think that I write about young people, but I don't necessarily write young stories. Mm-hmm. You know, there are usually things that I care about as adult me, but it's always the younger people are just the best messengers for me.
And do you find that you have to kind of stay on top of all things teen to be relevant or be believable to that audience?
No, I think you can't actually, because as soon as I learn a little bit of like teen slang or anything like that, by the time it filters up to us, it's already passé. So better to sort of stay away from that. I think that like what is universal is like tapping into the more raw emotionality that young people have, because they sort of haven't learned to regulate as much, or they haven't been told that they have to modulate their feelings. So I think being able to channel that is what allows me to continue writing for this sort of age group. And I think it makes it appealing across the board because we all relate to that.
That is such an interesting point, because that age group does sort of, you know, they wear their heart on their sleeves a little bit more than we typically do.
Yep.
So your latest book is Not Nothing, and it's a really interesting thing that you did in this book with the narrator, because the narrator is 107 years old. He is a Holocaust survivor. Tell us how you came to that decision and a little bit about how the story unfolds.
Okay, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. Yes, it is a novel for children narrated by a 107-year-old man named Josie. And I always knew, like as soon as this idea came to me, I knew that he was the narrator. I didn't know it was a kid's book initially, because a 107-year-old man narrating a children's book seemed like a stretch. But it was sort of a combination of factors that led to it. My grandparents were German Jews that fled Hitler in 1938, and they had a department store that they had to sort of leave behind that was much like the one that Josie's family has. So sort of that was part of it. In my 20s here in New York, I used to volunteer with an organization called DeRote, and I went and visited this older Hungarian woman every week, and we became good friends, and sort of her stories filtered in. And she was a Hungarian Jew who had lived through the war because of Raoul Wallenberg. Mm-hmm. And so that story was so fascinating to me. And then all of the other residents there, I thought, all these people have so much history they've lived through just by dint of their age. So sort of that was always swimming around in the background. And then we started to see this sort of resurgence in hate groups just being very vocal and open. And I know that part of our society is sort of always there, but seeing it so out was a little shocking. And I started wondering like what drew a person to that kind of group and what drew a person away. And I started doing some reading about that. And then finally I went to visit my sister, who is a nurse, and she was working in an assisted living facility in Seattle. And I met a 98-year-old man named Sam, who was an Austrian Jew, and he left Austria before the war. But the stories he told me, the wit, the warmth, the memory, his memory was better than mine. And so once I met Sam, kind of it all came together, and then it only took me another 6 or 7 years to write.
So explain the plot a little bit, because we know you have a 107-year-old narrator.
Yes.
But again, it's a book for young adults.
Yes.
So what happens?
Okay, my very crude shorthand is that it is the Princess Bride meets Schindler's List. So if you can imagine that, you've got the book. So it's about a 12-year-old boy named Alex who does something very bad, like truly bad. I'm not going to tell you what it is, you have to read.
Okay.
And as a result, he has to go and volunteer for a summer at an assisted living facility while he awaits his hearing to find out what's going to happen to him. And he does not want to be there. He is very angry and resentful and grumpy, especially after he meets the other teen volunteer, who's this bossy do-gooder named Maya Jade. But he winds up in the room of Josie, and Josie is 107 years old. He is just waiting to die and waiting and waiting, and he hasn't spoken to anybody in the last 5 years because he's kind of run out of things to say and people to say them to. But when Alex winds up in his room, for reasons neither one of them understand initially, he begins to tell Alex a story about a young woman named Olka, who he knew in 30s and 40s Poland, and Olka used to work for his family store. And when they first met, she was sort of angry and sort of small and a little even bigoted, and he almost gets her fired, but he doesn't. Instead, he asks her to teach him to sew, which sort of changes both of their lives. And basically he gives Olga this opportunity to rise to the occasion of her life, and she becomes a hero. And in telling the story to Alex, it changes Alex as well. And it's really sort of about, you know, what happens when you are not invited to be your better self and what happens when you are invited.
And it's interesting the relationship that they forge in the book because, as we said, he's 107, Alex is 12, and they have this kind of very unlikely but, you know, meaningful friendship. How would you describe it?
I mean, it's very much sort of an elder telling a story to a young person, but as they get deeper in the story, these two people who could not seem more different, you know, 107 years old and has lived through all this 12-year-old angry boy, they find that they have this sort of commonality, and they find it through the story, and it helps actually both of them to be able to tell and receive this story. So, you know, definitely Josie opens a world for Alex, but Alex also opens a world for Josie for his limited time left in it.
As I understand it, you mentioned this, the book took you about 7 years to write. Is that atypical for you?
It is becoming more typical for me, where what I tend to do is write a draft of a book, think it's garbage, put it on my hard drive, come back to it a couple years later, be like, oh, that's not so bad. Do another pass at it until it's kind of right. So like the last few books and the next few books are sort of all books that have taken a while. So I've learned sometimes you have to just let it come in its own time. And if you have enough projects going, you can keep producing work.
You know, I do want to talk a little bit more about your life as a writer. You've written a number of very popular books. We have to touch on If I Stay, which was translated into, I think, what, more than 40 languages? And ended up being made into a movie. Did you see that coming?
No, I wrote that book. When I started that book, I didn't have an agent or a publisher. And when I started writing it, I saved it on my hard drive as Why Not? Because I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. I'm like, this isn't really a YA novel. It's like about this girl, and it's in her head, and she's outside her body. So I saved it as Why Not? I wrote the thing, and then it kind of went off into the world, and it was just amazing, even before like the movie and all that, just to realize like something that you wrote in the privacy of your living room, reaching people all over the world and giving and having this sort of emotional experience because of it. I think that was my first experience as an author, understanding just like the power of words to connect you to people who are so far away and so, you know, not living a life similar to yours at all. And it was like very beautiful and very humbling. And then the movie and all that came, and that was kind of mind-blowing. Were
you happy with the way the movie portrayed the book?
Yes, and one of the main reasons I was is because when readers see the movie, like, they didn't change a thing. They changed a lot, right? They have to, but I think that the movie evokes the same feeling of the book and gives viewers the same feeling that the readers are, which is like the most I think you can ask for in adaptation.
Now you have another book coming out this winter, is that right?
Yeah, I have Afterlife comes out January 7th.
So can you give us a little preview?
I'll give you a little preview. So Afterlife is a young adult novel, and it's about a 17-year-old girl named Amber, and she's riding her bike home from school on like a spring day of her senior year. She's thinking about her boyfriend and prom and graduation, and she gets home and things are a little weird. The doors are locked, there's some weird pictures on the wall, the phone doesn't work. She's weirdly cold. Her mom comes in. She goes to the garage to greet her. Her mom screams because Amber died 7 years ago riding that bike home from school.
Oh my gosh, Gayle.
So that's like the first chapter. So it's about Amber and why she's back, and it's a present tense story of her, but it's also about all of these other people, her relatives, her boyfriend, her best friend, but also people she barely knew. And it's kind of this ripple effect of both life and death, and about kind of the thin veil between life and death.
That's so interesting. I would love to read that. And what, you know what, a note about that, what strikes me is that I really enjoyed this book as well. Clearly I'm not a young adult, but do you find that people who are not, you know, your typical audience, like adults, are reading this?
Yes, and they're always, I mean, this has always happened to me. I'll get people be like, I'm sure I'm not your typical reader, but I loved this book. And, you know, we don't have the best research on sort of who our readers are, but I think, you know, there's been some research, like young adult books are often read by adults. I think, you know, so it makes me very happy.
Yeah, sometimes we do it as a way to connect to our children, and then we find like, oh, I really like this.
Yes, yes. And this book, I really hope not nothing. I hope like grandparents read it with grandkids or older generation with much younger generation.
Were you always a big reader yourself as a kid?
Yes, I love to read. I used to just read nonstop. I was one of those kids that read under the covers, you know, when it was lights out.
Yes.
My dad
me too.
Yeah, my dad would take me every week to the Crown bookstore, and I would buy Sweet Dreams romance, and then sort of graduated from there. I read very inappropriate things at a very young age. I've always like, it's kind of amazing that you have like 26 letters and some punctuation and infinite stories, and that you can just like look at this thing and get lost in it.
Just a last question for you on this, Gayle. What would be your wish that readers, and young readers, I guess particularly, would take away from this book?
Couple things. One of them is just pay attention to the elders in your life. They are so valuable. They may seem like they come from a different era than you, but there's a way to kind of like chop through all the sort of artifice and understand that people are people are people. And when they were young, and even now, like they had sort of similar goals and aspirations and feelings that you do. So I would love for them to connect, and you know, the idea of us all, like, let's look for opportunities to rise to the occasion together.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Gayle, for all this time. What a pleasure it was chatting with you.
No, I love chatting with you, Carol Anne. Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed it. Next up, let's head to the podcast studio to find out what our Isabel Ortiz has for us in Breaking Books.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking Books. I'm Isabel Ortiz, and today I have the pleasure of sitting down with author and legendary dancer Lillian Colón to discuss her memoir, Lilly, the first Latina Rockette. Hi Lilly, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi Isabel, thank you for inviting me.
No, I am so excited to have you on the show today just because how legendary of a human you are. From your early years growing up in an orphanage in the Bronx to having dreams of becoming a dancer and then all the way to the stage of Radio City Music Hall as a Rockette, your memoir really was your journey of perseverance. So I wanted to know, what was it like for you to really reflect on your life and your journey and then write about it in this book?
It wasn't easy, and I never thought that I would write a book. It just was the next step after dancing on the great stage at Radio City Music Hall, and to give a voice to the little child that doesn't have the support and can really dream as big as I had dreamed, to becoming, you know, going from the projects to one of those Bob Mackie sparkle costumes. I never thought that that would happen to me.
And when you're writing about maybe some of the parts of your life that weren't the easiest, is it kind of a way of healing to really kind of take a deeper look on those issues?
At the time when I was writing it, I had to put it down so many times because I just cried. So I kept trying. I would pick it up again. You know, some little voice in my head would say, no, pick it up again, do it again. So I would kept picking it up, but it was hard to go through. And it wasn't until the end that I thought, you know, this has been a healing process.
I know you talked about in the book a part of your story where you were in the high school performing arts and you were with your late friend Freddie Prinze, and you were talking about, or he was actually telling you that there was a kind of an open call for Puerto Rican dancers for West Side Story at Lincoln Center. And you were kind of shocked by that because that was the first time anybody had told you you were Latina, you were Puerto Rican. Because at the orphanage, your Latin heritage maybe wasn't always acknowledged or celebrated. So for you, what was that like to look back on that? And then how did really embracing your Latina heritage really help in your professional life, your personal life?
Well, in the orphanage, everything was meat and potatoes. And before that, before I went to the orphanage, it was rice and beans. And so when we got to the orphanage, we weren't white or black or Latino or anything. We were just orphans. That's all we were. So there was no distinction between any of us, which in a way is a beautiful thing. But I realized that my roots had been stripped away from me the whole time I was in the orphanage. And I wouldn't be the dancer today if I wasn't Latina, because I didn't have the dance training that most little girls have. And so having el jícamo, el ritmo y todo eso, you know, to have all those rhythms and that culture in me, which is what made me succeed in the dance world, because I was able to jump ahead quickly.
I know that even without the orphanage, maybe your passion for dance might have not been recognized, because I know there was a dance class you took at the orphanage. If you can talk a little bit about that.
The Mother Superior, she brought in a dance teacher, and we had dance class maybe once a month. You know, it wasn't a lot. Most dancers, they start at 5 years old and they have dance classes all day long. For me, it wasn't like that. I had one class a month, basically, and but I loved it. The first day I danced, I was like, oh my God, I loved it. Now, all of us Latinas are in the street dancing all the latest hip-hop dances, so that was already in my blood. So, but Mother Superior never thought that I would become a dancer. She did not want me to go to the High School of Performing Arts. She was very adamant about me going to a Catholic high school. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. For some reason, it kept calling me. Mm-hmm. And I when I got the audition, she was, I can't let you go. And I was so sad. And she knew that I was not happy. So she said, finally, she agreed. And she said, only if you back on the orphanage grounds 45 minutes after the bell rings. So I would run out of High School Performing Arts to catch the first train so that she wouldn't take me out of the school.
Yeah. And your life pretty much came full circle because when you were at the orphanage, they took you on a field trip to go see the Rockettes, right? Mm-hmm. So how was that really coming to terms with how, when writing this book, how your life really is this full circle moment? Was it like a eureka moment or something, or maybe not?
Oh, when I went to Radio City and I saw how everything just comes together in every show, pretty much, with the stagehands and the lighting and everything comes together, everything works. And it was such a different world from where I was coming from, which was so unperfect. And this one was such a perfect world. Everything worked, and I longed to be in a perfect world. And I in Radio City with all that sparkle and that beauty that's there, I didn't have that in the orphanage or in the projects, and so therefore it looked so much different for me, and I couldn't not be there. I just had to be one of those beautiful women.
Yeah. And I know, too, in this book, you bravely talk about some of the most important and the highlights of your dance journey, and then you also bravely talk about some of the low times. And maybe one of those things that you talked about was the abuse that you went through with your first husband. Mm-hmm. But when you decided to include that, was there a bigger reason for that? Like, did you want to have readers maybe take something from your experience?
There was no training for marriage. There was no training for the outside world. Mm-hmm. Once those gates closed behind me, it was very difficult to live the Catholic life, perfect life that I was living in the orphanage with in the orphanage everything was pure and clean and beautiful and nothing, there was no the ups and downs of being with other, children, the bullying and things like that. Of course, all of that is always there. But with the nuns and the purity of the Catholic Church and all of that, that wasn't the same on the outside. And that's what I realized, that I wasn't really ready for the outside world. So I had gone, right into the fire. From the frying pan into the fire, which I never thought for one moment that anybody would ever put their hands on you. Yeah. So that was the part that I was, and I stayed. I stayed for a year, taking the abuse, and then I just couldn't anymore. And I had run away a lot from the orphanage. Of course, they always picked me up and brought me back. So I knew that I either had to run away, because a neighbor came out one day and said, one day you're going to kill her. And that's what woke me up. But sometimes you have to get to the bottom in order to realize that. And I was definitely at the bottom. When I left, I had no money. I had no clothes. I had nothing. I had a Metro card to get downtown to Broadway to see the lights. That's all I had, and that's all I wanted. And I was willing to accept that and what was going to happen to me at that point, because I knew no one at that time, and I thought, I'm just going to leave, because the pain was worse than staying. Yeah. So I had to get out, and I wanted to show other women that they can do it too, that you do not have to stay in a domestic abuse relationship at all. Yeah. You can move on.
Yeah, your book was really inspiring in those parts, but also just to see how maybe you had come from that struggle, and to see how your perseverance really got you to where you are today, or where you were as a Latina Rockette, as the first Latina Rockette, and now as an author. So you've danced on the stages of Broadway, were on the kick line as a Rockette, and then you're an author. So what is next for you? What do you hope maybe is your next creative dream?
My next creative dream is to be in the studio creating the story of Lilly, the Puerto Rican Annie, and open doors, continue to open doors for other Latinas to be able to perform on a stage such as Broadway and such as Radio City Music Hall, and to teach. I do teach dance and inspire children to continue to move in the process of life, because it doesn't stop. Just because you're retired from one thing doesn't mean you can't move on to something else. So it's constantly reinventing yourself. And I would love to direct and choreograph and possibly be in my own show and see that on Broadway.
Well, if your story of perseverance really showed anything, I'm sure that will happen and you will make that happen. But I'm so happy that I was able to speak with you, and I just want to say thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you so much.
As always, author and columnist Linda Stasi is back, and she has plenty to say about what she's reading. Here's Uncensored.
Recently, the world lost one of the finest authors of the last 100 years, Nelson DeMille. For me, it was not just the loss of a favorite author, it was the loss of one of my best friends, my mentor, and the man who encouraged me to become a novelist. When you think of a literary lion who had published over 30 novels, most of them bestsellers, and of those, God knows how many were #1 bestsellers, you might think of a loner who spent his time in contemplation and solitude. Ha! Nelson was the funniest, warmest, craziest, most outgoing person you could imagine. In fact, when Harlan Coben, another great author, and I were recalling Nelson the other day, he said, Nelson was the coolest dude in any room. Amen to that, brother. If I ever had to decide which of his books was my favorite, I think it would be a toss-up between The Gold Coast and Word of Honor. These books are as different from one another as a steak dinner is to a big dish of pasta. The Gold Coast takes place on Long Island's North Shore, aka the Gold Coast, which, once upon a time, was the center of the greatest concentration of power and wealth in all of America. Waspy John Sutter, a Wall Street old money lawyer, and his socialite wife live in this golden bubble of horses and immense, tasteful estates among people exactly like themselves and their parents and their grandparents before them. Into their staid world moves Frank Bellarosa, a tough-ass gangster who upends their lives, their mores, and their reality. I've read it 3 times, and each time I laughed just as hard as the first time. And each time I was gripped just as tightly as I was the time before. It's wise, it's wise-ass, and it's brilliant. Word of Honor could only have been written by a Vietnam vet, a hero, and an officer. That would be Nelson. This book is brutal and riveting. It's the story of a good man, a successful family man, whose past comes back to bite him hard when a book comes out about a massacre of children, nuns, and wounded enemy soldiers in Vietnam years before. The book is gripping and terrifying, told with the kind of touch that only Nelson DeMille was capable of. At his funeral mass, the Monsignor who presided was a longtime friend of Nelson's. He said when they met 30 years earlier, DeMille asked him which of his books he liked the best. The Monsignor said, well, I never read any of them. Nonetheless, they became great pals. When Nelson was on his deathbed, in typical DeMille fashion, he turned to the Monsignor and said, just read Cathedral. Even in his death, he makes me laugh until I cry. For Uncensored, I'm Linda Stasi.
That wraps up another chapter for us. Thanks so much for being here. A quick reminder to check us out on the CUNY TV app and on social. Let us know what you're reading. I'm Carol Anne Riddell. See you next time on Book It.